The ways both Ryan Poles and Ben Johnson talked about this upcoming NFL draft class sure made it sound like the Chicago Bears will be open for business to trade out of the 10th overall pick at the end of the month.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lauren Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1, and you can follow the podcast at Locked On Bears on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and the Locked On Bears YouTube channel, where you can keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. On the show today, I want to hear from Ben Johnson and Ryan Poles from the NFL owners meeting, specifically talking about this draft class, where they see some of the strengths there, and sounding like a team that doesn't sound super eager to pick with the 10th overall pick in particular. I also want to go through what Ben Johnson said about Caleb Williams and the importance of quarterback play and a specific analytic that we can walk through slowly here and maybe oversimplify a little bit so you can get the idea of how the thinking will be very different under Ben Johnson than it was under Matt Eberflus. And there were some other news notes and tidbits I want to get to about the Braxton Jones injury update, another big Karan Amagaji endorsement and what that means for the future of the left tackle position. An Eric Bieniemy quote about the running backs in this draft class that I think really says a lot, and also some thoughts on a potential Kyler Gordon extension being a priority for Ryan Poles and the Chicago Bears. But let's start with their thoughts on the draft class in particular, because I think we've talked about this as a concept before on the podcast of like, there's only so many great blue chip players in this draft class, and you're hoping one of them falls to you at 10. But if they don't fall to you at 10, then there's not as big of a difference between the 10th player in the draft and the 15th player in the draft, or even the 10th and the 20th player in the draft. And the player you take at 10 could end up being pretty similar caliber to a player you could still get at 17 or 19 or later on in the first round. And that might lead you to be more inclined to want to move down then if the difference between the players isn't all that different and you could add some extra picks by moving down. It sure would sound great to me. And now we're hearing Ryan Poles talk in a similar fashion. He didn't talk specifically about trading down, but he talked about where they see sort of the clusters and strength in this draft class and how there aren't that many blue chip players and the rest are kind of all the same way. Like when the way Ryan Poles talks here, he never uses the words trade down, but it's sort of implied if you read between the lines.
The beautiful thing of what we did in free agency, and we talked about this a few weeks ago, is I really believe we can look at the draft as a situation where we take best available, which is really important. I think it's really important for this draft too, because I think just the way it is, I think kind of the top blues, I think that's condensed pretty small early in one, and then there's a wide range of really good starter level players that are going to range from probably single digits all the way into 50, 60, 70. So really trying to pair where the depth is and where you can get certain guys. And like I said, just the collection of those guys I think are going to be important in terms of moving the needle for us.
Ben Johnson said very similar things, and I don't need to play his quote reiterating a lot of the same stuff, that like they see a lot of value in this draft, between the late first round and the second round and into the early third round. Like that seems to be kind of the sweet spot where, yeah, there's still a difference between the 15th player and the 30th player, but it's not as wide of a gap as it might be in other years where there's more blue chip talent at the top of the draft class. When Ryan Poles talks about, hey, there maybe single digits worth of blue caliber players for them. I'm no math major, but 10 is a 2-digit number where the Bears are picking. And if there's a single digit number of blue chip players, then odds may be that all of those blue chip players come off the board before the Bears pick at 10. And if they do, then we get in the conversation of like, okay, well, if the good players are gone and there's not much of a difference, then wouldn't you rather move down? Now, I do think if one of those blue chip players in their eyes does make it to 10, they will absolutely be glad to stay there and take that player and just take best player available, kind of regardless of position at that point in the process. But it's a question of how many guys they actually view in that blue chip category, and if other teams also all view those same players in those same blue chip categories, or if maybe there's one guy in particular that another team doesn't view and then he slips to 10, or vice versa. If there's a player that the Bears don't view as a blue chip player, but a team picking before them does view in that light, then they get picked instead of the player the Bears wanted, and somebody can make it to 10. Like, that all seems, those are possibilities here, but the likelihood would seem more like that most teams will probably have generally similar grades on the truly top players in this draft class and take them off the board before the Bears get a chance to get them. I suppose you could use that as an argument to say, well, couldn't that mean that the Bears would want to move up then to make sure they get one of those blue chip players? And I certainly think that's well within the realm of possibility here. I will say, though, when the Bears talk about the value of this draft being anywhere from 10 to 70, and you've got 4 picks in the top 72, you're not necessarily going to want to give up picks in that range that you already do like. If anything, you want to acquire more picks in that range that you like. That would come as a result of moving down, as opposed to losing those picks in order to move up and get those players. But again, we've talked about it on this podcast before. The challenge with moving down from 10 is that if you want to move down because the players aren't that different, who's going to want to move up? If you think, well, the guy we can get at 15 is about the same as the guy we can get at 10, so let's move down, why would the team at 15 want to move up to 10 if they think the guy they can get at 15 is about the same as 10? Like, all the reasons you want to move down are the reasons that a team wouldn't want to move up. You're left stuck on this idea that you have to find a team that likes a player a lot more than you do, and they feel like they have to move up to get him, but you don't feel like he's worth staying and taking at your spot. And I do feel like kind of the sweet spot player that could still be available at 10, teams could like more than the Bears just because of a scheme fit standpoint, is Georgia linebacker Jalen Walker, who's kind of a 3-4 edge rusher and too small to play defensive end in Dennis Allen's defense, but not really quite a off-ball linebacker either. He's kind of this hybrid player that just doesn't fit what the Bears want to do. But could there be a team that wants to move up past the 49ers at 11, or maybe the Miami Dolphins at 13? That could be teams that could take Jalen Walker, and that could be a player where it's like the Bears don't view him as a blue chip because he just doesn't fit what they want to do, but another team could view him as a blue chip and be willing to move up to get him. Like, there are possible fits here that could make that trade possible, but it's a lot easier to do in a mock draft simulator and on Madden than it is to do in real life. It's same thing with the Bears moving up into the top 10, right? If you want to move up to get one of those blue chip players, why would another team want to move out of the opportunity to take a blue chip player, right? If they're sitting there and saying, yeah, after like 10, all these players are the same, I don't want to move out of the top 10. I got to stay here and get a blue chip player. Like, it's just because you might want to move up to get one doesn't mean that team will be willing to move down and miss one of those players without you giving up an extravagant return in the draft capital trade. And that doesn't feel like a position the Bears are necessarily in, where you want to go all in on getting this guy. Like, you'd love to use these top 4 picks in the top 72 to get 4 quality young players for your team to build out sort of the foundation of this roster just a little bit more. So some interesting comments from Ryan Poles that sounded as clear as we've heard in any year in the Bears' interest in actually really kind of moving down. But of course, they could stay at 10 and still find a player they like. But I think they're definitely open for business if other teams were listening to those quotes from Ryan Poles. Also, some really interesting notes from Ben Johnson about how they're taking a different approach with Caleb Williams in terms of what they're going to emphasize with him and how that's going to be very different from the big thing Matt Eberflus emphasized. We'll go through what expected points added even means and how that contrasts from what the Bears emphasized before. Next on Locked On Bears. This episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by Gametime, the best way to get tickets for all of your favorite live events. Watching your team live and feeling the energy of the crowd and witnessing those unforgettable moments, like, there's nothing like experiencing a big game in person. Whether it's your Bears in the football season or your favorite college basketball team going on if they're still in it, or NBA teams with the playoffs coming up around the corner, Major League Baseball, hockey, they've got all of your favorite sporting events in the Gametime app, or concerts in person are so much better than just listening to the recording at home. Comedians, comedy shows, feeling the energy of the room. It's all there in the Gametime app. The Gametime makes it easier than ever to grab last-minute seats at unbelievable prices. Their Gametime picks help you find the best values and sorts through all the different ticket listings for the best deal for you. And you can turn on their all-in pricing, so there's no surprise fees at the end of the checkout process. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use our promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. That's LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. The NFL draft talk from Poles and Johnson to me was the biggest takeaway here. But Ben Johnson started a whole separate discourse among Bears fans and really across a lot of football media by talking about their analytical approach to offense and how they're going to handle Caleb Williams. And not only is the actual analytic interesting to me, but more so the contrast to how Matt Eberflus approached things with the quarterback is really what stood out to me, because the way that, especially Ryan Poles also talked about this, but Ben Johnson as well, but Poles having been here, felt like maybe some subtle shots at Matt Eberflus as well, because sort of the onus of this conversation is this debate between how important is it for your quarterback to not turn the ball over versus how important it is to not get sacked. Obviously, both of those things are bad. They're both negative plays. And individually, a turnover is going to be worse than a sack. One turnover is going to be worse than one sack. But from an analytics standpoint, you start to look at this over the course of a game, over the course of a season, and you find that a large volume of sacks is more negative for a quarterback than turnovers. Because, obviously a large volume of turnovers and a large volume of sacks, the large volume of turnovers are going to be worse. But when you have, if we say, let's say sacks are a bad play and turnovers are a pretty bad play. If you have a lot of bad plays and a few pretty bad plays, the sheer volume of the sacks at a smaller amount of bad is still going to be higher than worse thing of turnovers, but there's just always going to be fewer of them. If you get to the Jameis Winston 30 interception season, okay, then it starts to change the math a little bit. But when Caleb Williams has 6 interceptions, you could double that next year and still not be a bad season of being reckless with the football. So the way Ben Johnson talks about this, to bring this back to the analytics, is through the stat that's called EPA per play, expected points added per play. And it's not so critical to know the ins and outs of what EPA per play means, but the idea from Ben Johnson and Ryan Poles reiterated this is that turnovers are bad, but turnovers are no longer the end of the world. And if you follow EPA per play, you're better at EPA per play, that's more correlated with winning than just the turnover ratio, which is also important, but this has an even stronger correlation to winning. So here's how Ben Johnson talks about it, and then we can try and simplify this a little bit to make EPA per play not sound like algebra, but a little bit more digestible.
The way I understand it right now from our analytics team, the EPA in the passing game is really one of the most critical factors in determining wins and losses right now. That's probably changed over the last 5 years or so. I would have said 5 years ago, turnovers, takeaways, that was number one. From what I understand now, that EPA for the passing game has now surpassed that. So whatever team has the higher passing game EPA at the end of the game, they generally win that game. It's over 80% of the time. So it's a huge stat, and that's where we look to how do we help inflate that number, higher completion percentage, more run after catch opportunities. That's not to say we're not going to take our shots down the field and look for big explosive plays, chunks or touchdowns that way, but there's a lot of ways we can get that done.
So did you hear Ben Johnson say in there, in the last 5 years, we've kind of moved away from turnovers being the end-all be-all and now EPA per play being the end-all be-all? I don't think that was intended as a shot at Matt Eberflus, but it sure sounds like it, especially when Ryan Poles says the same thing. He's we used to kind of think turnovers were a big deal, but now we think this is a big deal. And that's now we know better, as in Matt Eberflus didn't know correctly. But to kind of simplify EPA per play as a concept very quickly for you, essentially it's a measurement of like on every single play, how much did the result of that play get you closer to scoring or farther away from scoring, right? So like it's sort of a neutral measurement of how is this helping you get closer to scoring versus not helping you get closer to scoring. So based on where you are on the field and how many yards you gained or lost on the play and what the down and distance was, how much time was left in the game, right? Like situationally, how much did this help you? You know, getting 3 yards from your own 20 is not as important as getting 3 yards from inside the red zone, right? Like getting closer there is more valuable. So it's a way of trying to separate, like on any individual play, how much closer to scoring did this get you? And so of course, when you think about it on one play, an interception is going to be worse than a sack. But if an interception is a negative number, I actually don't know like what the exact EPA per play on an interception is. It depends on where on the field the interception is, because an interception at the 1 yard line that gives the other team the ball at their own 1 is not as bad as an interception, you know, at your own 20 that gives the other team the ball in the red zone. So not all interceptions have the same EPA, just like not all sacks have the same EPA. But generally, it's this idea that if each interception has a certain negative value and each sack has a certain negative value, the interception negative value is going to be bigger on each one. But if you have a lot more sacks than you do interceptions, those higher total sack numbers are going to add up to a bigger negative than a smaller number of interceptions that are each individually more important, but collectively over the course of the year, not as important. Like I look back at like Caleb Williams this past season, 6 interceptions, 68 sacks. If Caleb Williams were to double that interception number from 6 to 12, you don't want him turning the ball over. Turnovers are bad, but 6 more drives that end in interceptions versus if you get that sack number from 68 down to, I don't know, 40, that's 28 fewer sacks. Think about how many Bears drives ended last season because of a sack. Like if you take away 28 sacks from Caleb Williams this season, how many more drives end in field goals instead of punts? How many more drives end in touchdowns instead of field goals? Because they got in the field goal range and then they got a sack and that killed the end of that drive. Like sure, you might lose 6 drives worth of interceptions if you doubled his interception totals. But if you get 28 drives worth of more field goals and touchdowns from reducing the sacks, then you're getting a net positive for your team. Like, yes, when you get sacked, you can still recover and still execute the rest of the drive. And that's why 1 sack is not as bad as 1 interception. But a series of sacks and a high number of sacks collectively can be worse than a comparatively lower number of interceptions, all within reason. You still want to prevent interceptions, just like you do want to prevent sacks. But when Matt Eberflus was harping over and over, don't turn the ball over, don't turn the ball over. We got to take care of the ball, protect the ball. The T in the hits principle stood for the ball, right? Caleb has to not turn the ball over. Like that isn't necessarily the most important thing, especially if that keeps your quarterback from playing fast and loose, from trying to make some of those bigger plays. Because maybe you don't emphasize turnover so much. Caleb forces a few things downfield. And maybe some of those are intercepted, but some of those that he forces downfield might get caught, will get caught. And if so, you have more turnovers, but you also have more explosive plays on offense. Like that can be a positive for your offense, even with the turnover going up. And so like you can add that on top of the gain you get if you also can cut down on the sacks, right? That's how you build towards a more successful offense. And then the analytics have borne out across the NFL that this is more important than just the turnover ratio. And you can think back to the Lions this past season. Everyone's kind of pointed this out already. That there was a game the Lions played the Houston Texans. It was like week 9 or 10. And Jared Goff threw 5 interceptions in that game, and the Lions won. And you know how many times Jared Goff was sacked in that game? 0. Like, yes, 5 drives ended in turnovers, but you also didn't have drives derailed by sacks. And if you know a 5-sack game can be pretty devastating depending on when and where and how those sacks come. And of course, your defense is a factor. The rest of your team is always a factor. It's not just purely what the quarterback does, but the point being that turnovers don't have to be the end-all be-all. Sacks don't either. And it's the idea is that, hey, maybe we should care a little bit more about sacks than we have in the past, and maybe we should care a little bit less about turnovers than we have in the past. Not ignoring turnovers altogether or putting everything about sacks, but just tweaking the importance of both of them a little bit to fine-tune it to get the best quarterback play possible and the most success for your Chicago Bears offense. That's all the analytics and Ben Johnson are trying to say with that conversation. So I hope that clears that up a little bit and makes a little bit more sense as far as the the scary math number analytics there is just about like how bad stuff is for you and trying to avoid the bad stuff that ends up adding up to more of a problem. Even if they're smaller things, it's just the volume versus the efficiency there. Some other news and notes from NFL owners' meetings about the left tackle position, both Braxton Jones and Karan Magaji, running backs in the draft, and a Kyler Gordon contract extension. We'll go through some quick hitters on some of these other news and notables to know from the Poles and Johnson press conferences next on Locked On Bears. The big conversations were quarterback EPA and how they view the draft class. But Ryan Poles was also asked about the left tackle position. Ben Johnson was as well. And Ben Johnson gave, first of all, a Braxton Jones health update and said, along the lines of paraphrasing here, that Braxton Jones is right on track. He's generally where they want him to be. We saw he posted a video on Instagram that he's getting out of his walking boot here pretty soon here. And that's the Bears say, hey, that's right on track. But Braxton Jones being right on track still means that he, and the quote was like, he will probably be limited in training camp. That's what Ben Johnson said. The word was probably and limited in training camp. And that sounds a little bit worse than what we initially thought when Braxton Jones first suffered the ankle injury towards the end of the season. Ian Rappaport had reported that, yeah, he's going to need surgery or whatever, but he should be good to go by training camp. Now it sounds like he won't quite be 100% good to go by training camp. So that means it's going to be all Karan Amagaji at left tackle all offseason, and Amagaji may be your starting left tackle when training camp opens. If Braxton Jones is not 100% good to go, and yet the Bears are very confident in Amagaji, both Johnson and Poles pretty strongly endorsed him. And if we hear the way that Ryan Poles talks about the left tackle position here and how, the quote that stands out to me that we'll hear from him now is that, this coaching staff hasn't even really gotten a chance to work with Amagaji and Jones. And of course, all the nice things he says about Amagaji, like this to me sounds like a general manager who is not feeling any pressure to draft a left tackle, at least not necessarily like early in this draft, right? It's not as though, oh my gosh, we got to get Will Campbell or we got to get Armand Membu or we got to get Kelvin Banks because we just need offensive tackle. This does not sound like an offensive tackle. This does not sound like a general manager who's overly worried about offensive tackle. Could still take one, but it doesn't need to be priority number one.
Yeah, and then you throw, Karan in the mix who, not only do I still think, highly of him, especially going back and just watching, the Washington game, there's a lot of signs of him being successful, especially at the tackle position. But then he also went through a tough spot, which was, the way it was set up was unfortunate. Minnesota wasn't a great outing for him. So, but there's only a very small sample size there. I know that competition is going to, make the best of both those guys. So we're weighing that as well as just who's best available in the draft. So it's all a part of it. It makes it a little complicated when now you're talking about kind of three deep in that space. But I think it makes us really ask tough questions when we're watching specifically like a left tackle. Like, is this guy going to make us better in year 1, year 2, year 3? How do we feel about our guys? Especially in the case where, Dan and Kyle and Declan really haven't had time with either one of their tackles. So there's a lot to work through.
So I certainly think left tackle is going to be in the conversation for the 10th overall pick. If Will Campbell or Armand Membu are there and the Bears view them as the best player available, like Jones and Amagaji are not going to stop them from taking an offensive tackle there. But I don't think they're really feeling any pressure to say, oh man, sometime in the first couple rounds, we got to get a new starting left tackle. Like, no. If an upgrade's there, we'll take it. If that's best player available, we'll take it. But the Bears also don't seem worried that if they go through this whole draft and don't get a new left tackle, I don't think they're going to be stressing about it too much. I think they need offensive tackle depth, and they could use another player at that position, but it doesn't have to be a first or second round pick who's going to be a guaranteed starter that is an upgrade over Jones and Karan Amagaji. Like they're not sweating it nearly as much as I think some Chicago Bears fans are when they're worried about Amagaji being a bust and Braxton Jones being no good and being injured, and now they really got to do something left tackle. Like I think they're feeling a little bit better about it than that. I also think they're not going to be so narrowly focused on Ashton Genty either when it comes to the running back position, where just like how offensive line, if he's there and it's the best player available, they may take him. But the Bears are not, it's not all in on Genty and do whatever it takes to get him. Ben Johnson was asked about the running back class and about Eric Bieniemy as the running backs coach. And Johnson, I'm not going to play the full clip for you because it's just a quick little thing, but Johnson said that they've been watching film on these players, so the coaching staff has been, and he said Eric Bieniemy has been really passionate about a few different running backs in this draft class. Running in the room saying, "Oh, we really got to get this guy. I love this prospect. This guy's going to be great. He'd be a great fit for us." Like kind of pounding the table on multiple running backs in this draft class. Maybe one of them is Ashton Genty, but it's not as though they look at this and say, "Oh man, if we don't get Genty, we're not going to find anybody we like here." Like there are other running backs in this class that your running backs coach Eric Bieniemy is really excited about. And so I don't feel like the Bears feel any of this pressure. He might fit in that category of blue chip guys that if they make it to 10, they'll take him, sure. But it's not a, man, if we miss out on Genty, we're really not going to be able to get a running back we like. I think they can find guys in pretty much every round of this draft, certainly the second and third and into the fifth, of guys that they would be perfectly happy with. That won't be as great as Ashton Genty perhaps, but can still be very, very good players for your team and maybe better than other running backs taken before them. You always find great running backs later on in the draft class. And certainly I think Bieniemy is already falling in love with some names beyond just Ashton Genty at the top. And one other priority conversation here, Kyler Gordon getting the potential for a contract extension for the slot cornerback. We talked about that early in the offseason here about how that should be a priority for the Bears, and Ryan Poles said as much, that this is a high priority for them and that's something they fully expect to be able to get done. I think it's just been more of a like, hey, we went through these free agent signings and the trades, and now we're getting ready for the draft. And there's not really a huge urgency at this point to sign Kyler Gordon, whether you do it today or 2 months from now. Like obviously before the regular season, maybe before training camp, the summer you want to get it done. But I think the Bears are saying, hey, there's no rush here. We'll go through the draft, go through rookie mini camp and stuff. And then maybe when Kyler Gordon's in the building for OTAs and minicamp, you can get his agent in, you can hammer out the negotiations, have him sign it while he's already in town, and he can go into the summer break before training camp with a brand new shiny contract. And I think it'll be a good deal for the Bears no matter what they sign Kyler Gordon to. Slot cornerbacks get paid a lot less than outside cornerbacks. The Bears could very well make Kyler Gordon the highest paid slot cornerback in football, and he still wouldn't rank in the top 10 among highest paid cornerbacks in football, period. Like slot cornerbacks are making, kind of in that $10 million a year range compared to like Derek Stingley just got $30 million a year. And Jalen Johnson is getting $19 million a year. Like they could pay Kyler Gordon $11 or $12 million a year. He'd be clearly the highest paid player at his position. And to me, that would still feel like a steal for this Bears defense. So I'm eager to see them get the deal done. I think it's a no-brainer. I mean, maybe is that affected at all by the draft? If you take a corner in the first or second round, or if there's a cornerback that you draft that ends up being better in the slot, and then you want to move Kyler Gordon back to the outside, and then does he cost more if you end up moving back to the outside? Like that's the one sort of trickier wild card thing here, but I don't expect that to necessarily be a huge factor here. And if you're drafting a corner early, it's to start in place of Tyreek Stevenson and not necessarily push Kyler Gordon outside. And if you draft a slot cornerback later, they're going to be a backup, and it's not really going to be something that threatens Kyler's playing time there. So all things considered, that one should be easy money for Gordon and easy for the Bears to negotiate and not really be a difficult, drawn-out negotiation that gets hostile or leads to a holdout or anything like that. So it should all be smooth sailing from here. All we got to do is focus on these NFL draft prospects for the Chicago Bears, and you can be sure we'll break them all down for you right here in the Locked On Bears podcast. You can listen on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Just hit that subscribe button to make sure you're keeping up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. We're part of the Locked On Podcast Network. That's your team every day. You can also every day get NFL Draft Talk over at the Locked On NFL Draft Podcast. If you're looking for a second listen today, check out Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez over there, bring you all the latest draft news and analysis and player projections and mock drafts and you name it all. They've got it over at Locked On NFL Draft for that second listen. Coming back tomorrow for another episode of Locked On Bears as your first listen. And in exchange, you'll always get another opportunity to bear down.